One of my favorite moments in any game happens in Luigi's mansion. Luigi is finding his way through the perilous mansion floor by floor. The second section of the game, up until the second boss, takes place primarily on the first floor, but we're introduced to the second floor proper shortly after. One of the first rooms that we find in the second floor is a strange room named simply the Astral Hall. To complete this room, the player has to pick up a fire element and shoot fire onto all of the candles, attracting a legion of ghosts that you then have to face off against. This moment in isolation would be enough to talk about, but it's paired very interestingly with the very next room, the Observatory. In this room, Luigi can use a telescope to witness a full moon. Soon after, tiny magical comets descend from the sky. Luigi can grab one and shoot it, seemingly blowing up the moon, leaving a half moon in its place. Luigi walks to the half moon and finds one of Mario's power stars inside of it. This power star is the ultimate conclusion of these two rooms from a gameplay perspective. The reason you were here was to grab this power star to share with Madame Clairvoyant, a piece of minor yet necessary progression for completion of the game. I'm less interested in what you get out of these two rooms than I am in the rooms themselves and the little stories they tell. It sounds weird to say given the game's cute and child-friendly nature, but Luigi's Mansion is a horror game. And horror is somewhat hard to define or even describe, but I think the best way to make sense of the genre, at least for this video, is to understand horror and all storytelling in terms of information. How information is conveyed and what information is conveyed is crucial to what makes storytelling compelling. If you give us too little info, no meaning can be discerned from it for the audience to latch onto. Too much info and the story starts to become mundane or lacking in any obvious point for the audience. Horror uses information selectively to generate fear and anxiety. The way this is done is by having just enough information conveyed that the audience is unsettled by what is implied that remains to be seen or can't be known. In other words, horror relies on knowing just enough that what you don't know haunts you. Luigi's Mansion, almost seemingly by accident, is a great horror experience, and that's because of its cute, child-friendly demeanor. Luigi's Mansion isn't a very story-heavy game. It doesn't communicate that much through dialogue, plot, or even through gameplay. Instead, Luigi's Mansion conveys a consistent atmosphere of anxiety and nerves. Luigi is, throughout the game, a largely nervous character. He hums a tune in dark spaces, and the more damage he takes, the more the sound of his humming becomes tense and fearful. Perhaps the best example of how the game captures a consistent tone of anxiety is in the fact that, absent the typical jump mechanic that the Mario series is known for, when the player presses A, the typical button used for jumping in Mario, Luigi instead calls out for Mario's name, almost as if implying that Luigi's confidence to be able to jump and platform like Mario in the main Mario series requires Mario's presence, and without him, Luigi's confidence is shaken. Games are a bit different from movies. You can turn off movies, sure, but games require active participation, which means that when a game is too scary, it'll stop the player dead in their tracks before they even bother to push forward. So if you hide something scary behind each door, the scarier the game is, the less likely people are to actually continue to open up each door. You need it to be just scary enough that they'll be nervous about opening the door, but not so scary that they refuse to do so. You need to convince the player to be a willing participant in the horror. Luigi's Mansion, throughout the game, accomplishes this very well for a kid's game. Certainly, there are some scary parts earlier in the game, but for the most part, the game does a good job inviting the player to progress. In new areas, for example, the presence of continuous random ghost encounters in the hallways means that the player will at times feel safer going into the next room rather than waiting in the hallway. The rooms become a reprieve from the threat posed to the player in each hallway area. The Astral Hall and the Observatory are not by any means the scariest part of the game. In fact, I would argue that the Observatory is one of the least scary rooms in the entire game. It's one of the only areas in the game that feels peaceful and inviting from the offset. These two rooms are interesting instead because they present a two-sided coin of the unknown that lends itself really well to a deeper horror that isn't communicated just by the moment itself, but is cause for reflection. These rooms create a sense of a bigger world than just the core game, with said bigger world having implications that could be a bit unnerving. So first, the Astral Hall. The Astral Hall is quite obviously a reference to seances and the occult. The presence of a star pattern on the ground might make one think of a pentagram, and the presence of candles could easily remind someone of the occult or of Satanism. The checkerboard pattern that lines not only the floor but the walls also creates this feeling that the Astral Hall exists outside of time and space, as if it's not actually a room that exists inside the mansion, but is instead some kind of illusion or other realm within it. There's a small trick that the Astral Hall pulls that we don't see anywhere else in the game. If Luigi attempts to enter the observatory before completing the Astral Hall, the door will instead loop back to the other side of the room. This can be done infinitely. This little trick helps create a sense of unease unique to this part of the game. The Astral Hall's occult energy reflects a sense of a spiritual unknown. The idea that beyond our world there are paranormal forces that we can't see and that would be dangerous if encountered. While the rest of the game does suggest similar ideas with the presence of ghosts, there's still a consistent thread of being detached from the real world that makes the rest of the game feel more like a pastiche than a genuine horror experience. The Astral Hall, by evoking real-world examples of human interest in the occult, can remind the player of an actual deeper cosmic unknown. What lies out there beyond us? What distortions of time and space, of life and death, of light and dark, are out there? While not particularly insightful, Luigi's Mansion does evoke a spiritual take on cosmic anxiety and uncertainty. What if we're not alone in the universe? The Observatory, interestingly, does the opposite. Rather than evoking spirituality, it evokes science, specifically astronomy. And while it does so in a really corny and simple way, the fact that these two rooms are right next to each other is interesting. The most explicitly spiritual room in the game, followed by the most explicitly scientific room in the game. And in the Observatory, we see not the presence of some potential greater other in the universe, but the lack thereof. We see our own moon, and it gets destroyed. We help destroy it, with not even a whimper of a cry against it. It's simply just a rock floating in space that explodes. This dry, quiet take on space, immediately following an implied seance, creates this feeling of an almost sort of atheistic view on the universe. If the Astral Hall creates this vague feeling of what if we're not alone in the universe, then the Observatory poses its inverse. What if we are alone in the universe? These are two major forms of existential dread, summarized by two adjacent rooms that have to be beaten back to back in Luigi's Mansion. And while the game doesn't heavily comment on the contrast between spirituality and science, nor any possible meanings that can be discerned from the juxtaposition, what the game does is leave the player with a sense of what tone they can take from it. Is the Astral Hall the scarier experience, or the Observatory? Is it scarier to be threatened by ghouls from an afterlife, or to simply realize that we are alone in an indifferent universe? Which idea is more comforting, and which idea less so? I don't think this moment is profound on purpose, but I do think it's profound at least a little bit. Because the sharp division between the most explicitly spiritual room and the most explicitly scientific one creates contrast that is loaded with meaning depending on how you experience these rooms as you play. Most people won't think much of it, but it's clear that these rooms, back to back, are intended as a single set piece. This dichotomy between science and spirituality is present in much of the horror genre and is present throughout Luigi's Mansion, down to its very premise. The fact that an old professor designs a device that can be used to capture ghosts, while obviously taking ideas from Ghostbusters, is also an example of how science meets spirituality. While I wouldn't say it's the core theme of the gameplay of Luigi's Mansion, it is a major theme of the game's premise. So to see this premise actualized in microcosm makes these rooms worth giving more thought. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you're new to my channel, I recommend checking out my video on Mario Sunshine, and if you like video essay work about games in general, I have longer videos about Shadow of the Colossus, Half-Life 2, and the Stanley Parable, all of which are worth giving a look. This video and the Sunshine video are both part of an ongoing series of shorter videos I'm intending to make that talk about how game design communicates meaning. Some of the videos will be from longer planned videos that I either scrapped or that I expect I won't get to for a while. This video, for example, was part of an intended longer video essay about how Luigi's Mansion's development and design approach accidentally led to a more engaging horror experience than I think the devs were trying to create, due to the way in which the bare-bones structure and storytelling left a lot of unsettling implications and room for a kid's imagination to run wild with it. If a video like that sounds interesting and you would like to see that or other expanded longer video essays that go in depth on the full game of any of the games I cover in this brief moment series, let me know. It helps me gauge which projects to prioritize moving forward. As well, this video would not be possible without the support of my patrons over on Patreon. Patrons get their names in the credits for videos, get access to longer video essays early, and help make videos like this possible. If any of that sounds like a reason to consider donating, I highly encourage anyone to do so. Have a wonderful day.